We're going to cover inflammation's role in three things that pretty much every girl cares about: muscle building, acne, and our gut health. Welcome back to Wellness Week the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the owner and founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And this is part 2 of our Debunking Inflammation 101 series, where we are decreasing the fear surrounding inflammation. And everything that we hear about inflammation is all bad, 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 when I want us to really just better understand it, because it is necessary in our bodies. It's necessary to build muscle. It's necessary to heal acne. It's necessary for our gut health. Inflammation plays a huge role within our body, a huge helpful role within our body. And I want us to better learn and understand when we want to actually promote inflammation and when we want to promote anti-inflammation, when inflammation has gone on for too long, and just, demystify inflammation. So that's what this series is about. This is episode 2, where we're going to get into local inflammation within various tissues. And we'll cover the skin, muscle tissue, and then also smooth muscle tissue related to our digestive tract. So before we get into it, a few updates. Again, the menstrual cycle program is being built and I need y'all's help. It is going to be the most comprehensive menstrual cycle program with workouts and education and videos on just different things you can do to help during your menstrual cycle, all of these things. And I would really like y'all's help for building it. So I need to know what you've liked from programs in the past, what you didn't like, how long you want the program to be, how many workouts a week, all of the logistics. So I'll leave a form below. There's an option to enter your email to be an optional tester for the program. Other than that, it's completely anonymous, and I'm just so excited, and thank you guys to all of you who have already submitted. Now we'll get into the meat and potatoes of today's episode, talking about tissue-specific inflammation. So we're going to look at inflammation at the local level, and we'll definitely cover inflammation at the systemic level, meaning the full body level, where you just overall feel swollen and cranky and your body's not recovering well or not handling different things well, different foods that you're eating. We'll definitely cover systemic inflammation. But before we do that, let's cover tissue-specific local inflammation. And I've chosen 3 specific tissues that we'll cover today and inflammation's role in these 3 specific tissues, because I feel like they are some of the tissues that we care the most about as girls and just as people in general. We want healthy skin. We want healthy muscle and a good body composition, and then we want a good gut health, right? So I wanted to break it down into these 3 tissues and how inflammation plays a role in helping us to heal from certain injuries that happen to these tissues. So that's what we'll get into today. If you missed episode 1, it's the episode right before this in the series. It is covering just the basic overview of inflammation. And so we'll cover it a little bit today, but if you want more specifics, check out that episode, because this episode will go into more specifics for each tissue. And you might be like, wait, what does she mean by some of the terms that I'm going to use today? Check out the episode right before this on inflammation explained, Inflammation 101, just the first episode in this series of debunking inflammation. So a quick inflammation overview. Our body senses damage and invader pathogens. Our immune system is activated. Help signals are sent out. Immune cells, specialized immune cells come in. Our little brother neutrophils, our big sister macrophages, and our middle sister with a vendetta lymphocytes to help clear up the debris, mark foreign invaders, destroy pathogens, and prevent infections to that injured area. Macrophages help control everything. So once that inflammatory process has run on and run its course enough, we start to switch towards anti-inflammation. And those macrophages, those older sisters, are in charge of helping our bodies switch into anti-inflammation so that we can start that healing process after all of the debris, all of the invaders are marked and destroyed. So that's just a generic overview of the process. But before we get into more local inflammation and how inflammation is handled at a tissue-specific level, I want to prep you guys a little bit, because some of these processes at different tissues will have overlap. In general, we are always going to have an initial stimuli, whether that's an injury, damage, an invader, infection, bacteria, whatever it is. We're always going to have an initial stimuli. We're always going to have that inflammatory process to help clear up that debris, clear up that damage, mark those invaders for future destruction. We're always going to need to transition from that inflammatory cycle to that anti-inflammatory cycle. We're always going to need remodeling of that tissue, remodeling of the area that's damaged, and then we're also going to need to perfect that remodel. So like anything that we try for the first time, we are not going to be the best at it. Same thing goes for healing of these various tissues. The first draft is not going to be as strong, as functional, as stable as the second and third and fourth drafts. So there's going to have to be tissue remodeling as well. So those are just the umbrella phases, but all of these tissues, skin, skeletal muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue in the digestive tract, will all sort of have this basic framework for how inflammation and healing go hand in hand. So to start off with wounds, I want to start off with why it matters. Like, why does inflammation in the skin and healing in the skin even matter? And that might sound like a silly question, but when we talk about acne, when we talk about having our skin trap in certain bacteria and be affected by certain invaders, acne can result from that. And the inflammatory has to go on in order for us to heal that acne, to rebuild up that area, to get rid of those foreign invaders in order to reduce the appearance of acne. And so I'm going to look at this wound and the skin healing process and inflammatory process in regards to wounds, because that's a little bit easier. So a scratch, a deep wound, a deep gash, something like that. But we can also look at it in the form of acne, because acne is something that the inflammation can cause acne, but inflammation is also needed to help heal acne as well. And again, it's when that goes on for too long that we might have that perpetual acne. But in the short term, we definitely need that inflammatory process to clear out the invader that's causing that sort of swelling, that redness, that buildup underneath the skin. And we need that inflammatory process and all those immune cells to help us clear out that area. So inflammation is important in handling acne, which I know is something that we all want better control over anyways. So for the skin, as far as the inflammatory process, inflammation, and then subsequent healing, the first step is called hemostasis. And this is immediately after the injury to a few hours after the injury. And this is when, again, think about a scratch on your skin and the blood that comes out of it. Again, I'm not going to get too gory at all, but initially, we want that bleeding to stop. So those blood vessels to the skin start to constrict. Platelets start to coagulate in order to form a clot at the skin so that we don't lose as much blood, we don't lose as many nutrients through the skin. Then we start to get into that vasodilation that happens in the first step of the inflammatory process to send nutrients to that injured area, to send, again, that blood vessel, those highways to send nutrients, to send to send oxygen to that area, to send all of the good healing molecules and immune molecules to that area. So initially we have that clot formation at the surface of the skin, and then a little bit of time goes through, 1 to 3 days after injury, then we start that inflammatory process where the blood vessels around the region start to vasodilate. We start to send more molecules to that area via those blood vessel highways in order to help heal that area. The inflammatory process ensues, so that means the neutrophils, that means the macrophages, that means the lymphocytes help clear out that area of damage, help clear out the debris, help with any sort of invaders that might have gone in once the skin was exposed to the external environment, once that wound was exposed to the external environment. The inflammatory process goes on in those first 1 to 3 days. Then we start to get into that proliferation tissue formation phase, which is 4 to 21 days after injury. So it's a lengthy process, but this is where we start to switch from that inflammatory phase to that anti-inflammatory phase. So the skin's injured, damage has occurred in some way, an invader has been found. We start to clear that out with the inflammatory process. And now we're switching over to that anti-inflammatory process in order to help rebuild that injured area, supply nutrients to that injured area, and sort of build the framework for new skin tissue and stronger skin tissue to be built on top of that. So in this proliferation and tissue formation phase, fibroblasts help to rebuild that extracellular matrix. Collagen also helps and it all sort of works together to form a scaffolding for new tissue to be built upon. I mentioned earlier that all of these phases have some overlap. This is where that tissue starts to be rebuilt in an immature way. So it's that first draft. We are not going to be perfect on our first draft, and this is that first draft for the skin. We have angiogenesis, so new blood vessels are formed to send more nutrients to that area in order to build back up that tissue as close as we can to normal skin tissue. Keratinocytes rebuild the outer layer of the skin, and then again, we have this immature sort of structure that the new, stronger skin and skin tissue will be built upon. So in the next phase, we have maturation and remodeling, this is days 21 to even years after the injury. And this is where that immature scaffolding, that matrix, starts to be reformed into more skin-like tissue. So collagen works to help transition immature tissue to mature tissue. Scar tissue formed starts to move and get stretched as we use that area a little bit more to be more in alignment with how the fibers are running from the surrounding tissues. So, your mouth, so let's say an acne scar on the skin. Your mouth is going to move up and down, and so that skin tissue starts to stretch a little bit more. That scar tissue starts to stretch in that way a little bit more compared to side to side. We don't do that quite as often, right? And so the new tissue starts to be molded and formed to the surrounding tissues to be used in the ranges that it needs to be used. So the scar tissue does take a little bit of time in order to transition from scar tissue, from that super protective, stiff feeling scar, in order to shift towards more skin-like tissue. So it does take a little bit of time, and it's not always going to rebuild back as perfect as before, which is why, we don't want to pick our acne scars, or we don't want to pick any areas on our skin, because scar tissue can be formed, and that will not necessarily mean that the new tissue formed with that scar tissue will be as strong as the surrounding area that wasn't injured. So it might not always be perfect, but our body will do its best to try to get it perfect to that surrounding tissue. So we need that transition from that inflammatory state to that anti-inflammatory state. Like I said, with all of these tissues, we do need that transition. In the skin specifically, if we don't have that transition, or that transition takes a little too long, we could have excessive scar formation, we could have excessive redness, we could have chronic sort of acne and redness and swelling in our face, depending on the bacteria involved. We could have lengthened wound healing if it is a deep gash in the skin. If the wound is very severe, where there is sort of a deeper and wider wound to the skin, see a wound specialist. A lot of the times we don't think about wounds getting that bad, but there are people out there who specialize in wounds, nurses, PTs, OTs, who know different chemicals and different compounds and different components to utilize in order to optimize the skin's ability to heal and the skin's ability to go through that inflammatory process, to go through that healing process, to heal in the right way, to have the most mature skin that we can without some of those adverse side effects of the weaker tissue area or too much scar formation. So there are people out there, and if that's something that interests you, it is a career, wounds are really cool. There's just the fact that the skin can heal in that way. I've seen, again, not to get too gory, but I've seen motorcycle accidents where there's so much burns and so much road rash where our skin just ends up healing all of that area and really closing it, and the scar starts to heal. It's just wild how well our body can heal the skin, but it needs to go through that inflammatory process, that switch from inflammation to anti-inflammation, and that subsequent healing process in order for all of that to heal back up and present in a similar way that it presented before. These experts also know which compounds to use at which stage of healing. So if you're trying to heal a wound and it's just not healing in the way it needs to, it might be beneficial to consult one of these experts to say, because they're able to analyze the wound and be like, oh, look, it is filling from the top down, or oh no, it's filling up over that wound, and you're going to have an open area under the wound that is a breeding ground for bacteria. So we really want to help the wound heal from the bottom up and really fill in. That way there's no pockets. So there's just different things that they can look at to help with that skin healing and making sure that skin goes through that inflammatory process in order to eventually heal. Okay, so next is skeletal muscle tissue. And again, why is it important that when our muscle tissue is injured or affected that we go through this inflammatory process and we go through subsequent healing? And the first thing that comes to mind, something that I care about, is exercise and muscle building. Every time we exercise, as long as we are providing the right stimulus to those muscles, we are going to have this micro damage within the muscle fibers that is going to cue the subsequent rebuilding, the subsequent strengthening of that area, the subsequent hypertrophy of those muscles, again, with the right sort of stimuli. But with exercise, with body composition changes, we want the inflammatory process because it helps to cue the subsequent healing process and the subsequent rebuilding up process of that muscle tissue in order to be stronger and just better than ever, right? So this is why it's very important that our muscle tissue goes through the inflammatory process and the subsequent healing process. So for muscle tissue, the first stage, we have an injury, we have inflammation, we have microtears. The muscle fibers are injured or damaged in some way, and there is local bleeding within that area, which helps to send out help signals. It does cause some of the swelling, but it helps to send out help signals like, hey, send things to the area. This is when inflammation ensues, right? So all the neutrophils come in, all the macrophages, all the lymphocytes to help clear out the debris, especially if it is something like a significant injury, muscle strain, hamstring tear, whatever it is. This is when all of those immune cells start to come in, start to cue that inflammatory process, clear out the debris, all of the inflammatory steps that we went over in the previous episode. After it clears out the damage, we start to the repair and regeneration process. So satellite cells come into play, which these cells are probably some of my favorite cells within the whole body. They live within the muscle tissue and they really just help repair and rebuild damaged tissue. They also help maintain the current tissue. They're stem cells, but they can move and their effects are pretty widespread on the muscle, and they're really just super cool cells. If I had to pick a favorite, these might be some of my favorite cells, but they help repair and rebuild some of the damaged skeletal muscle tissue. The fibroblasts help to build that collagen matrix as a quick fix until the real deal comes. So again, this is that first draft. It's that immature matrix that gets built to help secure that area, but it is very temporary and it is not the full tissue strength or capacity that we eventually want for muscle tissue. After the repair and regeneration phase comes the remodeling and maturation phase. So this is where that quick fix turns into a more permanent fix. So collagen and muscle fibers start to realign along the length of the muscle, and in order to promote this realignment, rehab helps, especially if it is a pretty substantial skeletal muscle injury. When that immature matrix is formed, it's formed in a sort of web where all of the fibers, all of those like little matrices are crisscrossed and formed, but skeletal muscle is pretty linear, right? There's usually a line of pull that we want to optimize for those new fibers. So rehab can help because we do want to be able to build the capacity of that muscle, utilize the muscle in a safe way in order to cue those fibers and those new fibers to sort of realign in the way that we want them to realign in order to maximize the efficiency of that muscle use later on. We also want it to be able to contract in the right way. So that means with the right range of motion, with the right speed, from the right length, at multiple lengths. So that's where rehab helps, because there really is this fine balance of not going at it too hard at the beginning and pushing it a little bit to where we are able to cue those muscle fibers in that new tissue in a certain way. And so there is a fine balance. And again, this is my specialty, this is my expertise. I just love it. And I think it's so cool that we can do things to help cue our body into this ultimate like healing and health stage after an injury based on how we load the muscle tissue. So that brings me to this last phase of skeletal muscle tissue, the inflammatory cycle and healing, which I'm calling the Kelsey phase because again, as a physical therapist, this is my like jam. I love this stuff, but building back up the capacity of the muscle. Muscles need to be utilized. Muscles need to be loaded. Muscles need to be able to work at certain speeds, at certain ranges, at certain contractile properties, like all of these things. And so in order to do that, there is a process of building back up that muscle tissue, especially because it is contractile, that we want to make sure we do in the right way so that we're not re-injuring our body after. And you might feel that the muscle is healed, when in reality it still needs a little bit more time or a little bit more purposeful speed changes or direction changes or different ranges that it needs to be challenged in, all of those sorts of things. So if you ever watch sports and your favorite athlete has an injury and then comes back a little too soon and tears it again, like that's where this comes into play, where they feel really healthy, they feel really good about where their body's at, but then they come back a little bit too soon because the demands of their sport are a little greater than the capacity of the muscle. And so that's where rehab and PT and building back up that capacity of the muscle comes into play. Okay, last tissue that we'll cover today. And again, there's so many different tissues in the body, but I felt like skin, skeletal muscle, and gut health tissue, so smooth muscle tissue, is super important for us and just some of those hot topics that we really want to know about. And so I thought covering these 3 today would be very beneficial and give us a nice sort of local overview of inflammation at each specific tissue. So we'll go into gut health and just smooth muscle tissue, which is the type of tissue that lines our digestive tracts. And if you missed our gut health episodes, I will link them below because we go over why it's important that this tissue is smooth muscle, how it's controlled, and I'll cover a little bit of it today just to give a brief overview. But if you want to dive in a little bit more specifically, I will point you to that episode and link it below. So if you remember from our gut health series, smooth muscle tissue in our gut is primarily controlled by our nervous system, and primarily our parasympathetic nervous system helps to control digestion. So smooth muscle is muscle tissue, but if I said, hey, contract your stomach, you wouldn't be able to contract it as much as your bicep because it is under subconscious control with our parasympathetic nervous system. So because there's a huge relation between our digestive tract and our nervous system, if we have inflammation in the gut, we can also have inflammation within our nervous system. So for smooth muscle, an initial trigger or invader is sensed. So this can be an infection, a pathogen, virus, bacteria, toxin, and that invader is sensed and help signals are released into whatever local region that invader was sensed at. Those help signals help to cue inflammation, so specialized inflammatory cells start to come into play. Again, our little brother neutrophils, our big sister macrophages, our middle sisters with a vendetta lymphocytes, they help clean up the area, clear out the debris, mark invaders, especially if it is a pathogen that our body sensed in our gut. And the smooth muscle is very, very sensitive. So as these immune cells start to do their work, there can be local damage to that smooth muscle of the digestive tract. So as they're clearing up the debris, as they're doing their job, there can be some permeability that happens within that digestive tract that makes it a little bit more susceptible to foreign invaders as well. And so as they're doing their job, as they're cleaning up, they also might damage that smooth muscle of the digestive tract a little bit during that process. So it has, during that inflammatory cycle within the digestive tract, we have increased permeability to the invaders. We have poor smooth muscle contraction to help with that digestion, which means we also have poor food motility or the ability for food to move along that digestive tract. So inflammation within the digestive tract, again, similar to, I guess, inflammation within skeletal muscle, like once that muscle's inflamed, we're going to have poor contractile capabilities, we're going to have more pain. The same thing happens at the level of the digestive tract in our gut health, but the difference is that sometimes we can't necessarily sense it until that process has gone on a little bit. So it's just something to watch out for and something to be mindful of with inflammation within our smooth muscle and our gut health tissue, is that while it's doing their job, while the inflammatory process is going on in that smooth muscle, we will be having some local damage to that digestive tract in the permeability of the smooth muscle and in how our body is actually able to digest the food through either the smooth muscle contraction or the motility of the food moving it along the digestive tract. So after that initial inflammatory process, we then have resolution and repair. So this is where we switch from that inflammatory cycle to that anti-inflammatory cycle. Messengers are released to stop that inflammatory response, and we transition into tissue repair. And then the next phase is remodeling and recovery of smooth muscle function. So smooth muscle, like skeletal muscle, is contractile. So again, we want it to sort of relearn how to work in the way that it needs to work throughout that digestive tract. So smooth muscle is remodeled like skeletal muscle so that it can contract and function in the way that it needs to. Scar tissue and excessive collagen production can affect how our digestive tract functions long term. So same thing with the skin, how the remodeling, the maturation of that area might not get to 100% of what the surrounding tissues are, but our body will definitely try its best. And it is just super cool that even if it doesn't get to 100%, that our body can heal it in that way, even if there's invader toxins, damage, whatever it is. So that gives the broad overview of inflammation with smooth muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, and skin. But I think most of us want to know, when do we want to promote inflammation for the healing process, and when do we want to promote anti-inflammation for the healing process? Because both are necessary for all types of tissues, but there comes a time where too much inflammation is a bad thing, but too early anti-inflammation can also be a bad thing. So we want to optimize the timing in order to optimize how our body heals from certain invaders, toxins, pathogens, damage, injury, whatever it is. When do we want to promote inflammation versus when we want to promote anti-inflammation depends on a few things. One, time. Early on, we want to promote inflammation. All of this process in all of these different types of tissues, inflammation is one of the first few steps because its job is to clear out those invaders. And so early on, within the relative time scheme of things, we want to be able to promote inflammation. And then later on, that's when we want to promote anti-inflammation. And I know those variables are very like, oh, it depends. Depending on the tissue, depends on when you want to promote certain things, because early on in a skin injury might be a little bit different timeline than early on in a muscle injury. Which brings me to the second point, that tissue type also depends on when we want to promote inflammation versus anti-inflammation. Some things take a little bit longer to heal than others, and so it does definitely depend on the tissue type. It also depends on the size of the injury, especially if it is a muscle tear, a wound, the size of the destruction or damage. The larger it is, obviously the longer the inflammatory process will go on, and the longer we'll want to promote that before our body switches to that anti-inflammation. And then age is also a factor. The younger we are, things just heal better. And the older we are, we want to adjust our timelines and expectations for that. So my high school patients heal so much better than my patients who are in their 80s and 90s, and they're both doing things right. It's just that youth does help heal. And so that is another factor that goes into when we want to promote inflammation versus anti-inflammation. And just as a little bit of a case study, but in physical therapy, there are some times where we do not want to promote NSAID use, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory use, because we want that inflammatory cycle after the exercises that we do in PT. So there are some times where we recommend, hey, don't do any anti-inflammatory measures, because we actually do want that inflammatory process, because that is what is going to help cue some of those satellite cells, or again, PTs and wound care, they might want some of that inflammatory process to ensue in order to help heal the wound. So there are things where, and there are healing stages where we definitely want to promote inflammation versus anti-inflammation in order to cue the right tissue response after. So overall, what can we do to help? We want to remove the stimulus for inflammation. So whether that's a motion, so if you're sprinting and all of a sudden a muscle tear happens, that's when we want to remove that stimulus. It can also be a bacteria, an invader, some sort of infection. Removing that stimulus is imperative for helping both the inflammatory process and then also that transition into the anti-inflammatory process. Because without, if that stimulus is sustained, if we keep doing that stimulus, then that inflammation is going to continue in order to help remove it. And so if it's under our control, we need to be purposeful about removing whatever stimulus started that inflammatory process. So that could be keeping the area clean, that can be limiting exposures to pathogens, and again, relative rest from whatever activity might have caused that muscle injury. We want to stay hydrated. Again, hydration helps for healthy highways for healing, and a moist environment is usually needed at some phase of the healing cycle for different tissue types, especially for wounds. So hydration is just huge in helping our bodies, again, through that healing process. We also want to fuel in the right way, again, to send good molecules, good nutrients, all the healing stuff down the right pathways, down those highways to get to those areas that are injured and that are damaged. And again, if we're fueling in the right way, that can also limit the foreign invader or the stimulus that's causing some of our gut health issues in the digestive tract. So fueling in the right way, getting all of the good macronutrients in order to help build back up some of that immature tissue and then build back up that mature tissue on top of that scaffolding and relative immature matrix. And then the last one, you guys know that this is just like our superpower. I've said it before, but breath work for just overall like stress management, parasympathetic nervous system activation, because that can help our overall environment for how our body heals, especially if smooth muscle and digestion is involved, because they are directly controlled by that parasympathetic nervous system. So again, this is going over specific tissue types and local inflammation within these tissue types. Our next episode will cover systemic inflammation, which I think will be super duper cool and enlightening of how we can limit that perpetual systemic inflammation where we have poor muscle recovery, we have gut health issues, we have constipation, we have redness or acne, like all of those things start to play into systemic inflammation as well. Today was definitely just tissue specific inflammation, why it's necessary for the healing process, and how our body is able to heal those certain tissues after inflammation has been cued, and when we need to transition from that inflammatory process to those anti-inflammatory processes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know it was long, I know it was wordy, I know it was sciencey, but it is super duper cool. I tried to make it super applicable so that you guys can apply some of this knowledge on inflammation to certain tissue types in your daily life, especially, again, we all get skin issues, we all sometimes have gut issues, we all sometimes have poorer time, like a harder time healing from different exercises or different muscle activations. So I think my hope is that it was very applicable and helps you to really solidify that inflammation can be a good guy, and it is actually a good guy. It's just when inflammation persists too long or doesn't make that transition from that pro-inflammatory state to anti-inflammatory state, that's when we can have some of these issues. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, share it with someone. It really, really helps the podcast grow. I have exciting things coming in the new year, and I've just loved doing this, and I hope you guys have gotten something out of it. Please message me if you have any questions or any sort of ideas for future episodes, things that you want me to uncover, things that you want to debunk, things that you want to learn about, especially from a physical therapist perspective. Please let me know. I am always open for suggestions. And thank you guys again for listening to this episode, and I'll see you guys again on the next Wellness Big Sis the Pod episode.